Cool. And folks can type in the chat. If you're just joining, you can put in where you're joining from if you want, obviously, if not, whatever. But yeah, since it's an unsecured line, people can use a fake name if you want to, or whatever, or not. And cool, people are still joining. And how this is going to work, I am going to be emceeing along with my dear friend Monty. And so we'll give a little bit of an intro, and then we're going to hear from all of the speakers. And then at the end, we'll have some Q&A. So if you want to ask a question, you can drop it in the chat. We're going to have some of our team members going through the chat and choosing questions for us. So you can just drop them as we go, and then we'll get to them at the end. And as you're asking a question, it would be great if you could say who the question is for, so we know we're not all interrupting each other to answer. And then, yeah, in terms of translation, so translation is available. We have one speaker who will be giving her talk in Spanish, but then for the Spanish speakers, they can listen to even the English speakers in Spanish. So the way that it works, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's like security, share screen, reactions, English, and there should be a little circle. So if you're bilingual, you can listen to the original audio and just listen to both. But otherwise, if you only speak English, you can click the English channel. And if you speak Spanish, then you can choose the Spanish channel.
And I'm just going to say that in Spanish for any Spanish speakers who are on the original audio. Este webinario tiene interpretación español, inglés disponible. Favor de elegir el idioma haciendo clic en el icono del globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. A menos que sea usted bilingüe, es necesario que haga esto el inicio para poder escuchar a los panelistas que hablan en español y para la sección de preguntas y respuestas. And we'll probably give these instructions again momentarily as people continue to join, but we will kind of get on our way soon. I'm Monty, by the way. I'll be hosting with Charlotte.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I think that's good for just the basics. And so we can start. Monty will give a little bit background about Jess, and then later on, we're also going to kind of circle back to Jess stuff, but use a lot of the middle ground to talk about the criminalization of dissent, how it's happening all over the world in a lot of different places. As I said, our speakers are from the Philippines, Palestine, and Honduras and Germany. So we're going to, and also the Stop Cop City protests in Atlanta. So we're going to be able to, yeah, just see how we can support one another and learn one another, and really, you know, find ways that we can support one another, and maybe, you know, share experiences where we can increase our solidarity. So I'll hand it over to Monty now.
Yeah, thanks for the intro there, Char. So kind of before we start off, we're with the Free Jessica Reznicek team. Jessica is a dear friend of ours who in 2016 cut holes in the Dakota Access Pipeline after spending many months kind of organizing against it and doing everything she could to stop it. And one of the points of our team is to get Jess out of prison. But kind of in doing so, we're pursuing things like clemency, and to get someone out of prison, you kind of have to focus on the individual. And so I just kind of wanted to like bring Jess's spirit into this, because everything Jess has ever done has been a part of a movement. Like when it comes to like her pursuit of justice, it's always been movement based, not about herself. And so like in some ways she would kind of hate the whole like campaign about her. So I just thought I'd like speak a little bit about the work that she was a part of before the No Dapple campaign. She was a part of the Occupy movement, and that was kind of a radicalizing moment for her. She took part in efforts for Palestinian liberation and was actually deported from Israel. And when she was researching US kind of like arms deals, she took a bunch of actions against Northrop Grumman. And when it came to the No Dapple movement and the fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline, Jessica got into the movement, joining a group of Native youth who were running to Washington, D.C. And she drove the car most of the time, and then was really inspired by the movement at Standing Rock and went back to Iowa, her home state, to kind of continue the work that was started at Standing Rock, to try and keep the water in Iowa clean. So I think that's something that's challenging about like about campaigns in general, about individuals, is because like we're here today to work together, and what Jess did was to work for the community, was out of love for the people and for the water. And even though the state often forces us in these legal channels to like focus on an individual, like the vocabulary of clemency forces you to focus on the individual. We just want to make sure that we don't get lost in like that the point of the work doesn't get lost, is like we're fighting for the earth and fighting for the community and fighting for justice. And just because the state sometimes forces us to talk about a single person, shouldn't kind of like detract from that. And yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we chose to put on this webinar, is to kind of go back to that point of showing that this criminalization of land defense, this criminalization of human rights defenders, is a global trend. And we want to acknowledge that and come together and figure out ways to support each other, and support each other's struggles, so that we can overcome the increasing obstacles that governments all over the world are throwing at us. And with that, I think I'm gonna pass it back to Charlotte.
Awesome. Thanks, Monty. Cool. So let's hop in to the speakers now that we know a little bit more about Jess. Our first speaker is going to be Michelle Winkler, based in Cologne, Germany. She does research and advocacy for a small human rights NGO on state violence and freedom of assembly. She is also active in struggles for climate justice and police abolition.
Should I start? Okay, cool. One moment. I just need to select the slides I prepared. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I prepared some slides, mainly with pictures, so you have some illustration of what I'm talking about. I would like to start with some information on German climate policy to give some background. Germany is one of the top 10 emitters of CO2 per capita and in absolute figures. Germany still generates about 20% of its electricity by burning lignite, the dirtiest fossil fuel, which is extracted in open cast mines, as you can see on the slide. The current German government consists of a coalition of 3 parties: the Social Democrats, the Green Party, and a very neoliberal party called Free Democrats. But similar to the previous government led by Christian Democrats, a conservative party, the current one is doing very little to set effective measures against climate catastrophe. The emission reduction targets it has set are not ambitious at all, and on top of that will not be achieved. The Federal Constitutional Court has strengthened climate protection as a constitutional goal in a ruling in 2021. The Climate Protection Act at the time was deemed insufficient by the court and had to be improved. However, the current government coalition has now decided to soften many of the targets again. The focus of the climate struggles in recent years has been in two areas. First, on the fight against fossil infrastructures and fossil corporations, especially the corporation RWE, who runs many coal factories and open cast mines in Germany. In the last decade, there have been large movements and actions against lignite-fired power generation. This included various forms of action, such as open pit and excavator occupations, as you can see on the slide right now, power plant blockades, forest and village occupations, as well as organizing with those affected by the resettlements. And in the future, the struggle against the expansion of gas infrastructure, especially against the planned construction of LNG terminals, will take on a greater role. LNG stands for liquefied natural gas. And the German government is planning right now to construct a lot of those LNG terminals. There have been many large blockade actions with several thousand participants in recent years, and also 2 large-scale evictions by the police. The eviction of the Hambach forest in 2018 and the eviction and destruction of the village of Lützerath in early 2023. Both evictions mobilized tens of thousands of people to protest the evictions. On the slide, you can see a little bit of the forest occupations. And I just talked about the eviction of the village of Lützerath, and on this slide here, you can see it was a very, very small village, and it's going to be destroyed soon, or hopefully not, by the lignite mining company. And it has been evicted in January and was, And maybe like one detail I wanted to show in the picture on the left side above, you see one of the occupied houses, and it was a house occupied mainly by feminists, and you see that there's like this feminist and trans inclusive sign, and what they destroyed for the destroyed first was this feminist sign also. And yeah. And the second, somewhat more recent area of struggle is the transport sector. Germany is a car country, as you all may know, and the car industry has a lot of influence in Germany. And the objectives of the struggle are, for example, the expansion of public transport and to make it cheaper or even free for everyone. And at the same time, the expansion of motorways should be prevented and speed limits for car traffic should be introduced. So we don't have any speed limits on some of the motorways still. And one of the first big mobilizations was the occupation of the Dannenröder forest against its deforestation for a new motorway and the protest against its eviction in 2020. And there have also been blockades, blockades of the International Motor Show in Frankfurt in 2019 and in Munich in 2021. And since the end of 2021, there have also been actions by a group called Last Generation. They are doing actions all over Germany, almost on a daily basis at the moment. And their main form of action is to glue themselves onto things, for example, onto roads or onto buildings and other stuff in order to obstruct traffic. And overall, the tendency towards civil disobedience and direct action has been increasing in recent years. And at the same time, repression against the climate justice movement is increasing too. Police laws have been tightened in the last years, giving the police much more leeway to intervene and surveil for so-called danger prevention. The most direct effects are the significant extensions of maximum durations in police custody. These are currently being used very frequently against climate activists, sometimes for up to 30 days, for example, in the federal state of Bavaria. The freedom of assembly is being restricted so that certain forms of action are made more difficult and assemblies can be more easily banned. For example, one federal state has imposed a general ban on demonstrations on motorways. Police brutality also plays an important role. In some cases, particularly brutal action is taken against young people so that they do not show up again at protests, and with intentional use of pain and using holds. But like everywhere else, the German police also act in a very racist way and are particularly brutal against during the big evictions of the forests and village occupations I mentioned earlier, thousands of police from all over Germany were deployed, and heavy equipment such as clearing tanks and water cannons were used against the protests, as well as dogs, horses, pepper spray, and batons. And what we also see is that the corporations who are targeted, they use civil law against the dissent, and they send cease and desist letters, for example, to activists whose personal details were collected during actions, and they also make claims for damages. And of course, this can get very expensive. So far, there have not been any very long prison sentences, and criminal offenses have not yet been made more severe in the recent years for climate activists. And there are also no charges of forming a criminal organization or of domestic terrorism until now. Legally, however, this would not be impossible. So far, it doesn't seem the political will. However, there were some house searches at the end of last year on a suspicion of forming a criminal organization among the activists called the Last Generation. The Domestic Intelligence Service of Germany observes the climate movement and classifies it in parts as extremist, mostly when demands for system change are part of the communication. And overall, with the emergence of the group called Last Generation, the tone is also becoming a lot harsher, and they have been called terrorists in the media on several occasions now. And in addition, the public is incited by the right-wing press to use vigilante violence against street blockaders, and this has already happened several times in the last weeks. I put a little photo of this in the bottom of the slide. And a little warning, I'm going to show those pain-inducing holes on the next slide. If you do not want to see this, maybe just, look to the side for like 30 seconds. I will say when it's over. So just to know what they are doing, they use these pain-inducing holes, which have really no sense else than induce pain used on the people they are used. And it's like a form of torture. And I passed the slides. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about what is going on in France recently, because, you're going to see. France has become a very, very authoritarian state in the last years, and this trend has accelerated under the reign of Emmanuel Macron, the president. And the French state employs a very brutal and heavily armed police force with a lot of special operations units. They act like a colonial occupying forces in Black and Arab working class suburbs. And they also brutally suppress social movements like the Yellow Vests movement, the ongoing strikes against the recent pension reform, and also movements for climate justice. And only 10 days ago, on March 25th, 30,000 farmers and activists responded to a call by the movement Les Soulèvements de la Terre, the uprisings of the earth, which links diverse local ecological struggles across France. And the large demonstration took place in Sainte-Soline against the mega water reservoir, which is under construction right now. And they went there as water defenders to protest this big project. And the French police very violently attacked the crowd. They launched around 5,000 explosive grenades, tear gas, and rubber bullets in a time span of only just 2 hours. 200 people were injured, 40 of them very seriously, and some have lost eyes or have been disfigured. And one person, their name is Serge, remains in coma right now, hanging on to life. And a few days after the demonstration, the French Interior Minister announced that he would have the Soulèvement de la Terre, the uprisings of the earth, disbanded and banned. And if this goes through, there would be a total ban on people coming together under this name, on fundraising, and on putting media out under this name. So, and also shortly afterwards, the Interior Minister called for another collective to be disbanded, a legal support group that works with radical movements. And in order to make the disbanding more complicated, the Uprising of the Earth are asking for solidarity right now. And for example, in signing the call, declaring to be part of the Uprising of the Earth.
Michelle, I just want to give you just a little indication. It might be time to start wrapping up.
Yes, I just wanted to say my last sentence.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to end my part here with this call for solidarity from our French comrades, or for our French comrades. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's really awesome hearing about, well, it's not awesome hearing about it, but it's really informative hearing about all the similarities that are happening in Germany and France with what is happening in the United States. In my experience, I've experienced police here using pain holds. And so you talking about the forest being cut down for coal mines, the scale of the mines themselves, and this massive expansion of liquefied natural gas. In the United States, it's often like pushed as like, oh, it's natural gas. It's like, yeah, but natural. And so that's also this big thing happening here. It's horrible to hear that Germany is using pain holds, but it definitely seems to be something that's happening globally too. And thank you so much for drawing attention to what's going on in France right now. I hope we can all of our listeners can follow that link up and support what's happening there. So our next speaker I'm going to introduce is Sandra Tamari. Sandra Tamari is a Palestinian organizer based in St. Louis and is the executive director of Adala Justice Project.
Thanks, Monty. Michelle, that was fabulous. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because the Palestine issue has been going for 75 years. So I want to give us kind of an understanding of where the US's use of terrorism comes from. A lot of it does come from the war on terror from 9/11. So I hope that you'll bear with me in that I'm going to get through a lot of information and I'm going to keep it on time. In late February, hundreds of vigilante Jewish settlers ran riot through Hawara and other nearby Palestinian towns in the occupied West Bank, leaving one Palestinian dead and several others badly injured, as well as torching homes and cars. In the immediate aftermath of the rampage, Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said Hawara should be wiped off the map. As condemnations began to pour in, Smotrich issued a statement claiming that the media was trying to create a distorted interpretation of his remarks. He said Hawara was a hostile village where residents throw rocks and shoot at Israelis, and that he supports a disproportionate response by the military in order to establish a deterrence. He later clarified that he didn't mean to say that the entire village should be wiped out, rather that the military should act in a targeted manner against the terrorist in the village. But make no mistake, Smotrich's genocidal comments represent an Israeli and, quite frankly, a US logic that all Palestinians who resist the theft of their lands are terrorists and must be eliminated. Many of the US counterterrorism tools have been originally tested out on Palestinians. Today, the domestic terrorism label is wielded against communities of color, even though the laws were pushed through to ostensibly quell white supremacist violence. They're not applied there. They're applied against our movements. The use of terrorism labels to clamp down on protests to defend the land has broad continuities between the US and Israel. Let's go back to October 2021. In the middle of the night, Israeli forces raided the offices of 6 leading Palestinian NGOs, or leading human rights and social services organizations. They sealed the doors with iron plates and posted notices on their doors saying that these organizations were declared to be terrorist organizations. This move was widely condemned internationally. The 6 NGOs are involved in a range of activities, including legal defense of prisoners, political prisoners, documenting the violations of children's rights, and supporting and advocating for Palestinians that are seeing their lands taken away by the state. The UN Human Rights Office criticized the raids as totally arbitrary, and that despite demands that the Israeli authorities present credible evidence, they have not done so, that these organizations are involved in any kind of terrorist activity. Obviously, designating civil society actors as terrorists is not a new strategy. It became prevalent globally after 9/11. The Patriot Act here in the US, for example, enabled the indefinite detention of non-citizens and expanded the government's authority to spy on its own citizens. However, Israel's hardline oppression of Palestine organizing is not limited to Palestine, but extends to the US too. For example, anti-boycott laws targeting the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement anti-boycott laws are legislations that threaten free speech, but directly target our organizing for human rights and justice. They were pushed originally by the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs. It is now against the law in 34 states in the US to boycott Israel if you are a government contractor. And it's important to remember that anti-BDS laws and critical infrastructure laws, like the ones that targeted Jess, have the same advocates, the same lobbyists, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. ALEC is a strange organization that brings together Christian extremists, evangelicals, and business interests, corporate profit-making entities like arms manufacturers and the fossil fuel industry that drive its efforts to quell our social justice movements. Finally, I'll point out what we all know. The war on terror is good for business. Israel has long acted as a laboratory to research, develop, and test cutting-edge security technologies and doctrines, all funded by US taxpayers. It was thus uniquely well-positioned to take advantage of the financial windfalls that the war on terror released for such projects. Israel quickly became a global leader in the development of drone warfare capabilities, border detection systems, aggressive anti-terror hit squad doctrines, and elaborate spy and signal intelligence systems. It developed and tested all of these weapons and strategies on Palestinians, particularly those in the Gaza Strip, where the territory's captive population gave these technologies the stamp of being battle-tested. A distinct and established Israeli military-industrial complex is now developed in the shadow of the war on terror. These technologies have also played a key role in US domestic affairs, from the use of Israeli drone technologies on the US-Mexico border, to the presence of Israeli-trained policing squads patrolling US cities. In fact, Cop City will be used to train Israeli forces in addition to police units from across the United States. The Israeli military-industrial complex has now spun off commercially, marketing its products not only to governments, but to any customer with the money to pay, arming authoritarian regimes and nefarious individuals across the world. In sum, I'll just wrap up with what we all know. What happens to Palestinians is a harbinger of what is coming for all of us. It's already here. And we have to stand together, as our co-hosts have reiterated over and over again. We have to come together to stop Cop City. We have to come together to free Jessica. We have to come together to free the earth and free Palestine. And thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Sandra. I see people clapping, so you have a happy audience. Yeah, that was super interesting to just have you string together for us how the US government sort of field tests this domestic terrorist label in other countries and now, applies it to our own movements within the so-called borders of the US and, the ties between critical infrastructure bills and ALEC and all of that. So thank you. Next up, we have Marlon Kautz. Marlon is an organizer with the Atlanta Solidarity Fund, a civil liberties organization which has been responding to the political repression of Cop City protesters. And as I could feel myself speak quickly, a reminder to all of the presenters to speak slowly for the translators.
Hello, hi everybody. Yeah, so let's talk about Cop City. For those who don't know, Cop City is there's a movement against a project called Cop City in Atlanta, Georgia, in the US. And Cop City is the name that activists have given to a massive police training compound, which the Atlanta city government wants to build. And the proposed site where they want to build this training compound is on a 300-acre section of forest in South Atlanta. That's probably no more than 10 minutes from downtown. And the indigenous Muskogee name for this forest and the creek which flows through it is Wilani. So it's referred to as the Wilani Forest. I should clarify that there are many organizers of the campaign against Cop City, to stop Cop City, and I am not really any of them. I am an anti-repression activist. My lane is doing legal support alongside social movements in the Atlanta area, which includes this one. And so I want to be careful not to be speaking for, the many different communities which have taken leadership in pushing this struggle forward. But suffice it to say, there are indigenous communities, there are church groups, there are abolitionists, there are Black Power organizers, preschools, environmentalists. It's just all kinds of people, all with their own reasons for opposing the city's plan. And I can't adequately speak to all of those. I encourage you to seek out, those voices and their perspectives of why they feel this project is a threat to them, a threat to their communities, etc. What I can speak to in detail is the response of the state to this movement and the repression which has been brought against these activists. So when thinking about the movement against Cop City, it's often maybe can be seen as or conceived as a land defense movement, and it has a lot of similarities to many other land defense movements that have been seen in North America, in Europe, or around the world. There's a place, there's a piece of land, and people want it to not be destroyed. And so we've seen in the course of this struggle, activists have occupied this forest. People have set up camps. There's folks who have done tree sits. At times, machinery has even been vandalized, like forest construction machinery has been vandalized. But there are also a lot of important differences from like a typical land defense movement or a typical like climate action camp, et cetera. For one thing, the movement against Cop City is in a major US city. Like I said, the immediate site of struggle is probably 10 minutes from downtown. And it's not just a dispute over an extractive or destructive plan for an area of nature. It's also an effort to build a police compound, which makes it a political struggle which is explicitly directly connected to issues of the policing of marginalized people, and especially in Atlanta, which is a majority Black city, or until recently was a majority Black city, Black people, the policing and violence against Black people. And so this has created an interesting dynamic, like an interesting political dynamic, where the police and the local authorities, they're not just, as we often see in many other eco-activism struggles, the police aren't just kind of serving the general interests of international extractive industry. They're directly protecting their own financial and material interests. Like literally, the cops who are responding to protests against cop cities are the exact same ones who will benefit from the facility. They personally have a stake in whether this political movement succeeds. And so this has led to unusually sharp repression, considering the scope of this project, right? Cop City is not a transcontinental pipeline. It's not a nuclear reactor. It's not a mega project. But because of the very clear stakes involved for the police, the government and the police themselves are willing to go all out in their efforts to suppress it in a way that we really don't see elsewhere. And so it gives us this interesting case study of what it looks like when there's a protracted movement which seriously threatens the agenda, the legitimacy of a police department. Distinct from maybe what we've seen in past mobilizations around like Black Lives Matter uprisings, where you have days of outrage over a murder, maybe you have a sequence of riots. Here we're seeing an ongoing political campaign, which for years is organizing a whole city and allies around North America to obstruct the agenda of its own police department. So I can kind of sketch out a sort of timeline or an arc of what this repression has looked like, and maybe informative for other contexts. So about 2 years ago when this campaign was beginning, we saw ordinary political repression, the kind that we might expect in any city during a popular mobilization. People would have a protest, cops would come and randomly arrest some of them, charge them with disorderly conduct, put them in jail for the night. That's kind of it. Normally, this level of pressure would be enough to deter protesters from continuing to mobilize. But in the Cop City struggle, it wasn't enough. And in fact, if anything, it made activists more determined. And so we saw authorities on both the city and the state level step it up. They started conducting mass arrests of protests, simple like peaceful protest marches, sometimes violently arresting dozens of activists, journalists, bystanders. And when even that didn't stop, it didn't blunt the momentum and the energy of the protest movement, they stepped it up even further, to the point that last winter, we saw them starting to invoke terrorism. And this happened in kind of two ways almost simultaneously. One way was discursively, and the other was prosecutorially. So we saw the governor of Georgia in lockstep with local police spokespeople and leadership all started calling protesters terrorists, describing what was happening around this movement as eco-terrorism, in a way that made it clear that they had been comparing notes, that they decided that this was an important repressive tactic. And soon after that, they started charging activists that they had arrested, who were doing nothing more than being in a forest, with domestic terrorism as a criminal charge. So this was unprecedented in our local context. It was clearly baseless. These charges, they have no way of possibly sticking, but they carry with them devastating penalties of up to 35 years in prison for being found guilty of domestic terrorism. So, I mean, we can think about like what was going on here. Like, why is the state pursuing this kind of strategy of terrorism? Well, it has several effects. The most obvious one is if you can arrest people on serious charges, you can keep them locked up, even if you don't have evidence of against them. You can get them denied bail, you can get them assigned high bail, you can keep them off the streets, away from being able to continue running their protest movement or participating in protests. Of course, it also makes an example of the people who get arrested and charged. It terrifies other activists. It creates a chilling effect that makes people worried about putting themselves at risk, even by attending a protest march or having a sign which says they support the movement, right? And especially people who are vulnerable to political repression, who can't afford to be in jail for, even a few days, and certainly, can't face the risk of a drawn out legal battle. It basically discourages people from associating with the movement. And it also demonizes the movement in the media, right? As we've heard, simply the invocation of this word terrorism brings with it an assumption of illegitimacy, right? As we heard from our last speaker, the U.S. foreign policy has been, ever since 9/11, that the U.S. government's orientation towards terrorism is that the terrorists are to be hunted and killed at all costs, right? They are enemies of the state. They're fundamentally illegitimate and they should be destroyed. And so this last point is very important, because invoking terrorism in a domestic context serves as a kind of dog whistle for more police violence. It legitimizes implicitly violence against whoever is being called terrorists. And so unsurprisingly, the next stage of repression that we saw was militarized raids of forest encampments. People who were police but are dressed as soldiers, pointing guns at protesters, threatening to kill them. And sure enough, in January of this year, Tortuguita, a forest defender, was shot and killed by police. And of course, they claimed that that Tortuguita had shot at them first, but every piece of evidence that's been revealed calls into question this story and contradicts what the official narrative is. Anyway, my time is running out. The last thing that I want to say is that the situation is all very grim. 42 people are facing domestic terrorism charges now. Some are still being held in jail and denied bond. Hearing all of this is very discouraging. It scares people from participating in movements. It discourages them. But it's important to acknowledge it and confront it and learn what we can do against it. And so I just want to go out by saying that the Atlanta Solidarity Fund, along with many other local resources in Atlanta and throughout the US, are ensuring that activists who are targeted with this kind of repression have access to getting bailed out of jail, getting access to lawyers, being able to bring civil suits against the authorities when they try these kinds of tactics against people, and call attention to the crimes the police and prosecutors are bringing against our movements. We are not helpless against these kinds of things. And particularly when we work together, we have the power to confront them and expose them as the criminal ones. So we're not going to stop what we're doing. And I want to encourage everybody there, everybody who's listening, wherever you are, to continue fighting from whatever your position is, and stand up whenever you see this kind of rhetoric of terrorism being deployed against movements. Because if we don't stop it here in Atlanta, it's going to come to wherever you are next. So yeah, keep up the fight.
Wow, thank you so much, Marlon. That was really amazing, hearing you kind of break down how the state is using the vocabulary of terrorism to dehumanize people, to delegitimize people, to make it so that they can kill people, and really kind of like destabilize movements. It's also really helpful to hear about the background of Cop City and hear you distinguish between like the differences between land defense, kind of like more traditional land defense movements, and the aspects of Cop City that are fighting the expansion of the policing of Black communities in US cities. And also just thanks for talking about how kind of we all have a responsibility to fight this narrative that corporations and police states are putting forth, calling human rights activists terrorists. We're learning from you and the rest of the panelists on this, and we can talk to the people in our communities now, and take what we learned here into different communities. So really appreciate you. Our next speaker is Berta Zuniga Cáceres. Berta is the coordinator of the Civic Council of Popular and Indigenous Organizations of Honduras, COPINH, fights for the environmental, cultural, social, health, economic, and educational rights of the largest indigenous group in Honduras, the Lenca people. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Berta.
Hola, buenas noches. Bueno, un saludo a
Hello,
todos.
good evening. Greetings to everybody. On my part, I want to comment to you that I come from the Lenca people in Honduras, that from 2019, when we lived a coup, we've been struggling in the defense of all territorial rights, but specifically in defense of the rivers. Given the coup, 49 rivers, new concessions of 49 rivers were given for the building of hydroelectric dams and other type of projects to generate energy only in our territory, which is probably compared to most of the territories from where the people assisting to this webinar come from. These are very small territories. So the struggle comes from how these projects were brought about in the framework of a coup, and that they committed the violation for the free, prior, and informed consent right that we have the right to have as indigenous peoples, and that it's been manifested or has been written in a series of international agreements in terms of indigenous peoples' issues. One of these struggles that was quite important and strong from the beginning was against the project, hydroelectric project called Aguasarca. This project comes from a company from Honduras that had capital or money from international venues. And this hydroelectric project for us represents this alliance between the corporate private interests and also the institutionality of the state against those communities that are defending the rivers and against the communities that are actually executing this resistance. So I wanted to comment that this is how we cannot talk about just one type of repression from the state, but that this alliance of private interests with the institutionality of the state come together. And in many times, we've said this in the past, you know, police security and our own military in the country was instrumentalized by this building company that was in charge of this project, but there was also an intention and an active participation of different functions of the state in order to subdue the will of the peoples in the defense of the territory, which is mainly Lenca people's territory. So our experience was one of experiencing these campaigns of to stop the legitimate aspect of this movement coming from indigenous communities. Amongst this campaign, and this is very common from all the participations of the panelists today, is to say that the communities are said or expressed or framed as violent. And this positions those that exert the violence as victims. And when they do this, they utilize massive media, you know, spaces of massive communication, and also using fake profiles on Facebook with names of the people of our organization in order to talk about how our struggle was a violent struggle. And it was also to attack our leaderships in a very strong manner, mainly Berta Cáceres, my mother. She was questioned. She was basically being exposed as she was leading this resistance, that she was the leader and the people were not really thinking by themselves, but that this was being manipulated and they were being subdued by this leadership. And we also want to express now that she was exposed as an irrational person, that she had family issues. Because we want to highlight, because criminalization faced by women that are leaders, is a very different type of criminalization that can come from male leaderships or that are opposed to male leaderships. There were threats, constant surveillance, following people, and externalize this surveillance. They were saying that they were putting it out there that she was being surveilled. Also, many of these people that were part of this company, they were either military personnel or ex-military personnel. And in this whole process of resistance that we have come to 10 years of resistance now in defense of the Gualcarte River, it was also stated that they applied this intelligence tactics were applied to destroy the resistance, the community resistance, or at least try to do that. And also to say that there's been some threats that were done on a direct manner, threats that are along on, this whole process of resistance to the families of these leaderships, mainly female leaderships. This was done in order to stop this sort of force, this clarity that comes from these efforts. And they did that using those tactics and threatening their families. Part of this abuse and intimidation towards the people that were producing this resistance, they were trying to have groups that were paramilitary groups that were paid by hitmen. And in these struggles, many people were assassinated, many people were wounded, amongst them my mother, Berta Cáceres. She was murdered in 2016 when the struggle in resistance to defend the river got intensified. And there was also some trials to reactivate the dam. So as part of these murders and the murder of my mother and the struggle we've had as an organization, something that remains very clear has been also the fact that in the rebuilding of this, the research and the inquiries that is being done, there's many instances of the state that participated, and they were actually producing audios and they were listening to leaders in an organization. And there were among the first lines of inquiry that the state of Honduras produced was that this murder was an internal conflict in the organization, that it was actually theft and personal reasons behind this murder. And this was done to blur and erase the real reason behind the murder. And this has happened in the past with other female leaderships in Latin America. And their death is masked as something different than the struggle itself. And this is something that remained quite clear. This surveillance on behalf of the state, after 7 years of struggle towards justice, we have actually achieved something that is not common in our country and very few times actually achieved, which is the ruling against 8 people responsible of this murder. 4 of these people are ex-military or military personnel. And this person, part of the company, this is an electrician engineer. He actually studied in an intelligence agency, West Point in the United States. And part of the major state institution in Honduras. And we believe that these tools and this, education, this military education is used to neutralize the resistance of indigenous peoples in Latin America. And because of that, it's because that we are pushing a law called the Berta Cáceres law for human rights in Honduras in order to cut the help in matters of security that is given to countries like Honduras and their governments to subdue the will of the states. And for example, some of those intellectual responsible for perpetuating these murders remain free. The criminalization of the protests, people are hurt, people are wounded, and a series of processes are legal processes. And just to use the last seconds of my participation, just to mention that the energetic transition, this supposed energetic transition, also affects our community, where we remain, defending our territories, and we ask to rethink, to reflect on these models of energetic transition in terms of the justice for people and communities along the world. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Berta. That is such a powerful story about your mother and the communities you're a part of and work with to protect the waters and the land. I think the story of your mother is such a tragic and stark reminder or warning of the real implications that labeling or framing, community resistors to these dangerous energy projects as being criminals, and the real dangers that led to your mother's death, unfortunately, of framing your mother as being delusional and these things, and the erasure of female leadership can just have such dire consequences. And also the ways that corporate and state actors use paramilitary force to intimidate and inflict violence upon communities. There's so many parallels. And I think it's also super inspiring to hear how you all have had some justice in finding, prosecuting the 8 people involved with the murder of your mother. So, there's a lot of tragedy and sadness, but it's also really inspiring to hear the work that you all are doing. So I hope and think we have a lot to learn from each other. So thank you. That was, powerful. Next up, we have Alab Airoso. Alab is a a climate justice activist based in Manila in the Philippines. She is now the convener and a national coordinator of YACAP, which stands for Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, the Fridays for Future of the Philippines. She strongly advocates that human rights and climate justice cannot be achieved without the other. And just a reminder to speak slowly for the translators, and also if we have time, we'll get to a Q&A so people can put any questions in the chat.
Thanks. Thank you all for having me. I think the speakers before me already said a lot on the actual the reality of a lot of activists, and actually that's also what I'll be talking about today, in particular to the Philippines, where we have an anti-terrorism law. I'll be sharing a couple of slides and just to discuss more on the context of the Philippines, also how actually US military is also a huge factor in what's happening when it comes to militarization in the country. So in the Philippines, for a bit of context, we have been experiencing an armed conflict or a civil war for the past 54 years. And the government really has, instead of discussing and getting to the root cause of the armed conflict, they'd rather create these institutions to assert the dominance of the government and the military through the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or we just call it NTF-LCAC, and also the passage of the Anti-Terrorism Act, which have been passed in the previous President Duterte, who already has a record of hundreds and thousands of extrajudicial, extrajudicial killings with his war on drugs. So the anti-terror law was passed during the pandemic, during around 2020, wherein the world was experiencing a global pandemic. The Philippine government was pushing for a law to basically attempt to silence their critics, especially at a time wherein it's lockdown, no one could actually protest about it. So this stifling of dissent has already affected the participation of youth in climate action, in particular now that we have a new government, we're in a new administration, which is actually the son of a previous dictator, or Marcos. So this terror law, it essentially allows government officials or the NTF-LCAC to paint any individuals or pinpoint anyone of their choosing and say that they're terrorists, similar to how it's being done in the other countries and other speakers that was mentioned earlier. So what happens when they're painted as terrorists? They can be detained illegally. They have trumped up charges that they have arms, or like simple civilians who are essentially in the city protesting. They're essentially tagged that they're part of the armed conflict, that they're rebels, but what in reality they're actually just activists at home. They're creating campaigns, but at worst it leads to their deaths. It leads to enforced disappearances. It leads to extrajudicial killings. It leads to raids to offices. So actually one of the effects here as well can be seen even before the law was actually passed, because the war on terror has been, it's parallel to what's been happening in the US, where it's like after 9/11, people are tagged as terrorists. So to give context for the previous administrations in the Philippines, it's not that much of a difference whether there was a law against terrorism or not, because the administrations have seen human rights violations a lot, especially to environmental defenders and climate activists. So the father of our current administration, Marcos Sr., we've seen notable instances such as assassinations of indigenous leaders, Makliing Dulag, for opposing the construction of a dam in the Cordillera region, the mountain regions. And our previous president, the Duterte admin, has saw numerous environmental defender killings, and we have been dubbed as one of the most dangerous countries for environmental activities because of the killings that has been happening to our rangers, to our indigenous people, to our small farmers and fisher folk. So a quick look into the militarization in communities now as well. It's also been the terrorist tagging of our environmental groups. And the first year actually of the anti-terror law, that 9 indigenous people from the Tumandok tribe was killed only because they were believed to be supporters of the communist rebel groups regarding the local dam project that they were opposing. So in the more recent times, it's been almost 2 years, almost 3 years rather, since the passing of the anti-terror law. Now there's parts of our country has been experiencing indiscriminate bombing, such as bombing runs, artillery shelling near residential areas. This military presence and military bombing is believed to, I guess, strike to the hearts of where there are supporters of communist rebels, but in reality, these are indigenous groups. These are small farmers. These are people living their lives in the land wherein social services aren't as accessible, and yet the military is there to enforce surrenderies, saying that they're rebels, or they're there to take the whatever they have, the land that they have, and sell it to the mining companies that are extracting our natural resources. Excuse me. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the militarization that comes along in the countryside is also the main reason for enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings that are happening. And the thing is, it's not that exposed. Like, the media doesn't cover it as much as so we have to rely on the communities reporting on what's actually happening on the ground. Additionally, there are other laws that are being passed, such as the SIM card registration law, wherein we're required to register our SIM cards. So essentially, it's selling our information to the government, but there's also that increased risk for surveillance, which has been it's essentially legal with the anti-terror law. And then there's also the push for a mandatory reserve officers training corps, or ROTC, which we have seen with the culture of violence of the military. It's propaganda essentially for the government and for our military to say that, oh, it's okay, militarization is okay. To add to a more recent happening here in the Philippines, and it's also been a long time relationship of our country, is with the US military. We have a lot of agreements wherein we are taking part essentially of the US military action. So that one of them is the Visiting Forces Agreement and the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or VFA-EDCA, wherein one of the Balikatan exercises, or it means like joint exercises that will be happening this month, actually like next week, will be happening in mountainous areas, in areas near the coast, wherein a lot of biodiversity, a lot of marine life, and actual residents will be affected by the live firing, by the war games where they're gonna sink an old Navy ship into the waters. So it's something that a lot of our progressive organizations are opposing, and we're really calling for the for US troops to be out of the country. There's also the construction of new military bases that will be happening and that are being planned to happen around the next year. So a lot of it is really the encroachment of military forces that aren't our own, and it's clearly for the antagonizing of activists or advocates, and it just adds to the artillery essentially of our local government as well. But with all that happening in our country, and seems like it's also happening to everywhere else, the fight continues, and that's something that we all like to accept, that we want to really believe that with the solidarity that we're doing here, we have every reason to oppose the ongoing militarization, and we want to support the calls of peace negotiations to get to the actual root cause of why there's an armed conflict. In the face of increased repression, we want to increase our ranks and work collectively. We can't do this alone. Something that was mentioned earlier with Jessica about like how everything she does is because of a movement, is with a movement. And I think that's something we can all take a piece of, and we continue to connect with and fight alongside the most impacted sectors. It's not just the activists, but it's the communities themselves who are collectivizing. They're the ones organizing. And we stand in solidarity with all the communities that was spoken with earlier. And we hope that by having these conversations and having more of these webinars or like international conversations, that we can gather strength and have support for each other. So yeah, that's it for me.
Wow, thank you so much, Aleb. Hearing about how just like the parallels and how the government of the Philippines is criminalizing activists is really striking. Like, I love how you talked about how like there is a conflict actually. There's like a conflict between the government of the Philippines, between the US military wanting to cut down forests, corporations wanting to take new lands, wanting to build new military bases, and people who live there, like the indigenous people, the communities who live there, the people who are trying to fight climate change. And that the government is using this vocabulary to be like, actually, there's no conflicts. Like, we don't need to resolve this conflict because y'all are terrorists. The only conflict we need to resolve is how we're going to like dehumanize and kill the terrorists. And I think that that's also just like something that it's a really impactful way to kind of break down the issues that like we're facing as a globe right now, as we face kind of climate catastrophe and fewer forests that governments and corporations are still trying to cut down. Is like there actually is conflicts as we fight for water and fight for justice. And we really need to stop governments from trying to obscure those conflicts through these eyes of terrorism. And I really hope that we can all support each other through these violent times. And through these times, I also just how you talked about how like the father of Marcos was just killing people, you know, but now with like a more liberal leader, the son of Marcos, he's actually like trying to find legal ways to kill people. And I feel like that's also true in the United States, where it's like maybe 40 years ago, people like the union workers would have just been killed. But now it's like Joe Biden is passing legislation that simply will disappear you or something. So I really appreciate your perspective and how you broke everything down. Our next speaker is Alex Cohen. Alex is a member of the Free Jessica Reznicek team and is a wonderful soul. So without further ado, I welcome Alex Cohen.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's been great to see everyone here and a part of this call. As Monty talked about in the beginning, Jessica got involved with the Dakota Access Pipeline first when she heard that the indigenous youth were running from North Dakota to Washington, D.C., demanding that Barack Obama stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. After she partook in that run, she went back to Iowa and decided to fight the pipeline in her home state, where a majority of the pipeline actually runs through the state of Iowa, and protect the waters that she grew up swimming in and sought refuge in. So Jessica did that. She went and found where they were boring underneath the Mississippi River. With her guitar and some tires, she blockaded the only access road. She was arrested, and she was released 24 hours later. And eventually she was asked where she could be without being arrested. And the sheriff pointed to the ditch, and she asked the world to join her. And slowly the world did. And what we saw kind of coming out of that, what I want to run through here is kind of a legal timeline about the state repression following the historic Dakota Access Pipeline movement. And so what we saw towards the end of this struggle was leaked documents come out of the published by The Intercept, which came out from Tiger Swan, who was the private security or mercenary group hired by the pipeline company as private security. And what we saw in these leaked documents was the clear strategic attempt by industry to label this historic movement as a terrorist movement. And you can see that clearly through the leaked documents that this was industry setting the stage for the police in the country, for law enforcement in the country, on how they would like people protesting them to be characterized. And so we saw that stage being set early on. In terms of Jessica's case, in July of 2017, Jessica made a public statement admitting to dismantling parts of the pipeline before it was operational. In August of 2017, we saw the pipeline company file a lawsuit in the federal courts, which tried to use racketeering laws to come after Jessica and dozens of organizations and hundreds of individuals, some named and unnamed, to try and say that this was a criminal enterprise and try and use the courts to characterize the movement as that. In October 24, 2017, 4 Democrats and 80 Republicans sent a letter to then Attorney General Jeff Sessions and asked that Jessica Reznicek, as well as the valve turners, be characterized as domestic terrorists. ABC News reports that collectively, these Congress members received $36 million in fossil fuel contributions. So it is not random. And we're seeing in 2017, the stage being set by industry to characterize movements going forward that resist pipelines as terrorist. In 2017, we're seeing critical infrastructure laws sweep the nation in many different states. In 2018, we saw 17 activists, which were charged with critical infrastructure laws in Louisiana. These activists were fighting the tail end of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And by June of 2019, conservative lawmakers had introduced 18 laws in 18 states, specifically criminalizing people who protest fossil fuel infrastructure. Simply for trespassing, right? So these looked like escalated charges for just trespassing. You could end up with a felony for being on what they deemed as critical infrastructure. In September of 2019, a federal grand jury, so we're talking 2 years after Jessica made an announcement owning up to what she did, in very typical Catholic worker tradition, which is where she comes from in the tradition of plowshare actions. But 2 years later, in September of 2019, a federal grand jury indicted Jessica on 9 charges. 1 count was conspiracy to damage an energy facility. 4 counts were use of fire in the commission of a felony, and 4 counts of malicious use of fire. If convicted of all these charges, she was facing up to 112 years in prison. It's important to note right now that Jessica was never indicted on a crime of terrorism, ever. As we move forward on this timeline, in February 8th of 2021, the U.S. District Court of Appeals upheld a lower court ruling that actually said the Dakota Access Pipeline was operating illegally. It is still operating to this day. And on June 30th, 2021, a federal judge applied a domestic terrorism enhancement, not a charge, but an enhancement at her sentencing, which made her sentence go from potentially 3 years to 8 years. The judge also applied 3 years of followed supervised probation and $3 million to be paid to the company behind the Dakota Access Pipeline. And it's important that people reflect on this because in this sense, the judge has sentenced Jessica to a life of incarceration. Jessica is a Catholic worker. She took a vow of poverty and a vow of nonviolence. She will never have $3 million. And so this has implications for the rest of her life, not to mention it's money going towards a fossil fuel corporation in the midst of a climate crisis. In November 4, 2021, after this was applied, Jessica's lawyers filed an appeal in the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals to appeal the use of the terrorism enhancement. And many organizations filed amicus briefs in support of Jessica's appeal against the terrorism enhancement. This included the National Lawyers Guild and the Water Protector Legal Collective, which argued that Jessica's actions do not constitute terrorism, but also laid out the legal implications for indigenous sovereignty if this terrorism enhancement were to stick. The Climate Defense Project, the Center for Protest Law and Litigation, Honor the Earth, the Climate Disobedience Center, and Code Pink not only argued in their amicus brief that Jessica's actions do not constitute terrorism, but they said that there's also a necessity for climate action to be happening right now in the midst of that, and that in fact pipelines are more dangerous than those who protest them. The Center for Constitutional Rights and legal scholar Dean Suda Sethi filed an amicus brief that focused on international law and the international consensus of terrorism. And they concluded that if in Jessica's case, based on the government's reasoning for applying this terrorism enhancement, if this were allowed to stick, that the United States will have moved so far past the international consensus on what is defined as terrorism, that it will be operating in a completely different legal realm. And Catholic Social Action filed an amicus brief using the Pope's encyclica from 2015 on climate change to say that not only do Jessica's actions not constitute terrorism according to the law, but that Jessica was acting in line with the directives of the Pope and the encyclica to take actions on climate change. In June 6th of 2022, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, 3 judges upheld Jessica's 8-year sentence, but punted on deciding whether or not the terrorism enhancement was aptly applied or not, and said instead that whether or not it should have been applied in Jessica's case, it was a harmless error. And based on all the conversations that have come before me, I don't think I need to explain that there's nothing harmless about the US government labeling you a domestic terrorist. And now here we are today, where you see the case in Atlanta and you see this global escalation happening. And at the Campaign to Free Jessica Reznicek, we said we weren't originally going to have a campaign until the terrorism enhancement was applied. Jessica owned up to her actions and thought she would get some type of sentence, but we did not think that this terrorism enhancement would be applied. It was when the terrorism enhancement was applied that we launched this campaign. And so we're really focused on reversing this precedent. We kind of ask people to think about, I think it's easy for folks to say, well, this doesn't impact me because I would never do what Jessica did. But, in Atlanta now people are being called terrorists for just having mud on their clothes or for simply occupying a tree. And just last month, we saw the Ohio police issue a directive saying that Aaron Barakovich has the potential for special interest terrorism because she hosted a public meeting in East Palestine, Ohio, after a company's train derailment. And so at this point, it's clear that it doesn't actually matter what you do, and that the state is using this term so loosely that truly what happens in Jessica's case and what happens in Atlanta happens to all of us. So we ask people to get involved in the Campaign to Free Jessica Reznicek. You can go to our website. And you can purchase a t-shirt. You can sign the petition. Signing the petition is a great way to get involved because as we prepare for the next legal maneuver, as we prepare for the next legal battle to get this precedent reversed, then the petition is the best way to sign up because you will be on the email. You will be on the email list to hear about what's coming up. And you don't have to wait around. You can start writing an op-ed in your local paper talking about Jessica's case and the implications this has. You can start emailing your elected official and talking to them about Jessica's case and start educating them on the case. So as we move forward with clemency, people are already aware of what's going on. So thank you very much for coming, and I'll pass it back to Monty and Charlotte.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you to all our panelists today. This was really amazing. I think we're at this point in history where climate collapse is kind of happening, and there is this really real conflict between the people who have had power for tens and hundreds of years, like the corporations and the governments who've been working together to wring money out of the earth. And it's getting to the point where there are a lot less forests to wring, where there's a lot less clean water, where this danger of climate collapse is knocking at our door, and where 80% of the world's biodiversity is protected by indigenous people. And the governments around the world are working together to be like, we're actually not going to deal with this conflict. We're going to call indigenous people terrorists. We're going to call people like Jessica who want clean water terrorists. We're going to call communities in the Philippines terrorists so that we can build more military bases. And the United States often has a big hand in this. So I think that's also important to acknowledge. Because the people from the United States and people who are organizing here also have a responsibility to kind of own that. And people watching this have a responsibility to affect change here, because affecting change here will also affect change in how the US conducts itself globally. And so I think the US and governments around the world, we've heard, are kind of ramping this up because the conflict is getting more and more dire, you know? And they're trying to find legal ways to make it illegal to have clean water. Like Alex said, the Dakota Access Pipeline, like the courts declared it illegal. They're like 4 years after it was built. They were like, actually, that's illegal. And so we're kind of facing this conundrum of like, what are the legal ways to stop an illegal pipeline? And we're kind of getting an answer that there aren't really. The only legal ways to stop these pipelines is to let them get built, or the only legal ways to stand up is to not stand up. And there's nothing more dangerous than not standing up right now. And I think we're seeing this as we look at history, as we look at what's happening now. Like a year ago when we had a webinar, Cherie from Bayou Bridge Fight said, like, what happens to Jessica happens to all of us. And like, we got to fight for Jessica, because and I think that applies to all of the panelists here and all of the countries that we've heard from here. And so I really hope we can work together. I'm really grateful for this coming together. I hope there can be a lot more. We'll continue sending out information about everyone's campaigns. And yeah, and so thank you. I just want to say thank you. And I'm very inspired, and I hope we can continue to change this narrative. And just as the governments of the world are testing new technologies and new pain compliance holds and new weird laws that make no sense and are incredibly dangerous, like, I think us as the people can also test new styles of organizing and new coalitions, because people on Earth right now have a responsibility and a need to work together to, you know, have a livable planet, and to free each other and love each other. So with that, Charlotte, you want to hop in as we kind of close this up?
Definitely. Yeah. My heart is feeling full connecting to you all and hearing your stories. We unfortunately don't have time for Q&A because we got to hear so much juice from the work that everyone's doing, which is awesome. But I really liked what Alab said, you know, like, this is an international conversation that we are having, that we should be having. You know, the point of this webinar is to really find ways to connect to one another and learn from each other's movements. So I really hope that conversation can continue after we all exit out of these tiny little boxes on our computers. We're going to be sending out emails with the links to everyone's work, so you can follow up with people there. Sorry we didn't get to questions. And yeah, I'm just feeling really inspired. And I also just want to lift up what Marlon said too. You know, it is important to know about this stuff and to know what we can do and kind of flip the script and expose them as criminals, because they are. And, you know, I'm going to take a lot of strength from that and from what everyone shared. So find ways to plug in either with us and with other campaigns that exist, or create something on your own, which is great too. So I hope you all have a great morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Everyone really is around the world on this call, which is really incredible. And yeah, just thank you all. And thanks to translators too. That's not an easy task. So yeah, hands up for the translators. Thank you. All right. Bye, y'all.
Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.